Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. Today we expand on our year-long exchanges about the future of democracy, human rights, and civil society. You can view these episodes on the Open Mind website, with National Democratic Institute President Ken Wallach on the resilience of democracy, UN Democracy head Annika Savil on the front lines of grassroots reform, UC Berkeley Human Rights Center Director Alexa Koenig on global justice, International Refugee Assistance Director Becca Heller on American liberty and the refugee crisis. And now we're privileged to welcome the leading international voice on human rights. Ken Roth is Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, the world's largest global human rights organization, which operates in more than 90 countries. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Alexander. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. The future of democracy. With the rise of what it appears to be a new wave of totalitarianism, we might say fascism, how are we to grapple with this particular moment in our history?
Well, first, I wouldn't go that far. Let's not call it totalitarianism yet or fascism. I mean, those are the ultimate fears. But
why do you think that's an exaggeration, though?
Well, I think what we're getting today is the rise of a series of politicians, some gaining power, some aspiring to power, who are pursuing an anti-human rights agenda. They typically say, we speak for the majority. We may even win an election. And that gives us the power, they would even say the right, to trample on the rights of minorities or the disadvantaged or people they just don't like. And that is dangerous. I mean, taken to an extreme, you're absolutely right. That's where you get to fascism. Because, we've heard this in the past. We've heard about these, totalitarian leaders who say, I am the people, and we're going to just trample on you because you have a vision different from mine. So it's dangerous, but we're not there yet. I think we have warning signs, but we can react to them. But yes, we are seeing that rise in the United States, in Western Europe, and in other parts of the world.
Now, there are some rather simplistic answers to the question of to what do you attribute the rise, if not of fascism or totalitarianism, a demagogic instinct or impulse?
Well, I think that, why are these populists rising? It's partly a sense that government and the elites are not answering to certain needs of the people. And this is, people who are left behind economically by the global economy and transformation technologically, automation in the factories, things like that. Part of it is fear of terrorism, fear of physical security. Part of it, frankly, is cultural change, because we've seen in North America, in Europe, much more multicultural societies. And many people relish that, but some people feel threatened by it. And this combination of fears and concerns has given rise to people who are exploiting that for really anti-rights reasons. They're pursuing an agenda that claims to be speaking for these left behind people, but doing it in a way that promotes Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment, in this country, anti-Mexican sentiment. And so there's an ugliness that is accompanying it.
In those 90 countries, if you were to extrapolate on the American experience, the European experience, you see what we thought of as fully democratized countries undoing some of the rights-based methodology in principle and practice that we've come to expect, whether that's voting rights in the US or immigrant rights in Europe. In those 90 countries, as the leader of an organization watching, monitoring human rights, what most concerns you?
Let me answer that in two parts, because first of all, there are the traditional threats to human rights. If we understand democracy in its fullest, it's not just periodic elections. It's also respect for human rights so people can organize together and make their voices heard. And it's the rule of law, meaning that government is held to account under human rights standards. Now, if you are an autocrat, you don't like human rights and the rule of law. You don't want your people banding together because, it just gets in the way of what you want to do. It gets in the way of your corruption. It gets in the way of your autocracy. You don't want independent justices holding you to account. So you try to trample down on those. And so we see all the time pushback by authoritarian governments trying to stifle civil society, stifle the free press, undermine the independence of the judiciary. That's almost like our day-to-day concern. And the human rights movement is always pushing back against that. Now, what is newer in the last couple of years is that even in democracies that were more established, where we thought that we had broad recognition of the importance of rights as an element of democracy, we are seeing the rise of what you might call majoritarianism. That is to say, politicians claiming to speak for the majority, but wanting to then act without the encumbrances of human rights, without the limitations of an independent judiciary. And that is extraordinarily dangerous because if in the heart of democracy in the West, we see this lack of respect for basic rights principles, you can imagine the ripple effect that has across the world.
So as you look at the wave of dissent and the fact that in many of these countries dissent is not possible anymore without retribution, criminal or otherwise, are you still very much focused on the aftermath and the ongoing repercussions of the refugee crisis?
Yeah, I think a big reason why there has been this rise of anti-rights populists in Europe in particular is because of the flood of refugees that came into Europe in 2015. And there were reasons for that. There's these horrible atrocities committed by the Assad government in Syria. There were 4.5 million refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. Many of them were not able to build normal lives, so they got on these rickety boats, risked their lives, crossed the Aegean, and went into Europe. That gave rise to a backlash where people were saying, we don't want all these newcomers, particularly because they were Muslim. That was a big part of the reaction. And so, yes, that has, I think, helped the anti-rights voices, as well as, other voices such as the Brexit, the anti-EU voices that you saw in the UK. Now, I think it's useful to look around the world and say, well, what would a country look like if you have an autocrat who claims to speak for the majority without concern about rights? And we have some examples very near Europe. Look at Turkey, where there was, fortunately, an unsuccessful coup attempt this past summer. And the Turkish people rallied around Erdogan, who said, we're going to crush the proponents. They said it was these Gulenists, the people who were followers of the cleric, in the exiled cleric in Pennsylvania. And so at first, many citizens of Turkey said, great, go after the Gulenists. We don't really like them anyhow. But of course, the autocrat never stops there. And at this point, Erdogan is shutting down the independent press, shutting down civil society, firing academics, devastating Turkish democracy. We saw something similar in Egypt. After the Arab Spring, after Mubarak had been toppled, there was an election, and President Morsi, a Muslim Brotherhood leader, was elected president. Many Egyptians didn't like an Islamist president. There was a coup by the army, and many Egyptians supported it, saying, oh, this is going to be better than being led by the Islamists. But of course, General Sisi, now President Sisi, proceeded to shut down Egyptian democracy, throwing in prison journalists, human rights activists, anybody who dared dissent. So today, the repression is much more severe in Egypt than it ever was even under the long-term dictator Mubarak. So this is what happens when you have somebody who claims to speak for the majority, who for short-term reasons says, what we need is to ignore human rights, and it's very rare that an autocrat says, well, I'll just do a little bit of violations of human rights. There may be the other guy whose rights are violated today, but very quickly it's going to be your rights violated tomorrow.
So as you look at the countries pre-Arab Spring and pre-refugee crisis that already practice to a great degree intolerance, whether it's Saudi Arabia, other Arab nations, or China or Russia, and I mean intolerance in response to any question of dissent, it's almost as if the problem has just exacerbated, become more complicated, and we're no longer, as a society, paying attention to maybe even the more devastating clampdown in these more stable countries.
I think, Alexander, what we're talking about in part is that there has always been a certain double standard in U.S. foreign policy. So, yes, the United States for a while was in favor of the Arab Spring in Egypt, but it never promoted reform in Saudi Arabia or Jordan or even a place like Morocco. It was perfectly happy to have a friendly king, a friendly monarch, even though the democratic aspirations of the people in Saudi Arabia or Jordan were utterly unfulfilled, but this was an American ally, so we're not going to rock the boat. So there was always that kind of double standard. What we're seeing now, as there is a rise of this kind of anti-rights sentiment in the West, is that many Western governments that ordinarily we could rely on as being, occasional at least, proponents of human rights, are now so preoccupied by what's going on at home that they've stopped being very effective abroad. And in part, this is, a failure to react to the serious backsliding in rights in places like China and Russia. In part, it's been, the utter failure to stop the slaughter in a place like Syria. And of course, you still get the double standards. You still get, no attention to the rights of Saudis at home. And indeed, the U.S. is arming the Saudi military as it indiscriminately bombs in Yemen. So there are big problems and growing problems in U.S. and Western support for human rights around the world.
Are there particular regions or countries that you have your sights set on in this 2017 year where you really hope or are expecting progress?
Yeah. No, I think it's important to ask that question because it's not like everything is a disaster. I mean, there are parts of the world that are going better. And you can answer this in part by taking the big picture, long-term perspective and recognize that, 2 decades ago, Latin America was filled with military dictatorships, and today it's mostly democracies. And indeed, the trend is positive. I mean, you ask, where can we make progress in the next year? One of the biggest impediments to democracy in a few places in Latin America has been this infatuation with sort of anti-imperialist governments that trampled human rights because they just stood up against the United States. And that could be Cuba, that could be Venezuela. There are a number of governments that fit into that category. We're seeing really the decline of that model. Venezuela is the perfect example of an autocratic leader who has stifled the checks and balances of a democracy. The opposition actually won the legislature, but can't get anything done because the presidency controls the judiciary and it controls the electoral commission, and it's just, blocking everything. But then Venezuela is an economic basket case. I mean, the country in the world with the largest oil reserves is in poverty because of utter mismanagement. The people want to get rid of the president. They want a so-called recall referendum, and he won't even let it happen. So, that kind of model, just being anti-imperialist as being sufficient for legitimization, is waning. And we see, other examples of that kind of mismanagement in other parts of the world. I mean, look at Russia today. People like to lionize Putin as the strong man who gets things done. But in fact, he has a one-horse economy. It's all about oil and gas. He never diversified when he could. So when the price of oil drops, the economy is a disaster. He then, in order to change the subject and build nationalism, he, takes Crimea or engages in the war in Syria. That works for a while, but not for the long term because people are getting poorer and they're hurting.
If you look at the most populous region of the world, or the continent, Africa, by and large, there's been an absence of attention on what could be a real revolution of human rights in what was formerly known as more the continent of dictators. Do you see potential there to counteract some of the trends in Europe and the Middle East?
Well, Africa is a real battleground today. On the one hand, you get a series of presidents who are facing term limits, usually after 2 terms, and they say, I like being president. I don't want to have this term limit. And they rip up the Constitution or they get it amended or whatever. And sometimes that has worked. A place like Rwanda, where Paul Kagame is such a dictator that nobody dares oppose him, where they tried it in, say, Burundi, or today in Congo, it's led to massive violence because there's protests and then the president shoots back. So there is, that's a struggle that's very much underway. We've seen a separate manifestation of this around the question of the International Criminal Court, which is, a global court designed to step in for the worst atrocities when national courts fail. And indeed, Africa was at the forefront of the creating of the International Criminal Court. The chief prosecutor is an African. But a number of African leaders are saying, oh, we don't like this court because it's so far been focused only on Africans. And they say, you're discriminating against us. But of course, they're discriminating in favor of the African victims who, without the International Criminal Court, would have no recourse. Now, several leaders, foremost the president of Burundi, who's shooting people who are protesting his third term, and President Zuma of South Africa, who has his own corruption problems, pulled out of the International Criminal Court. The other person who did it was the president of Gambia, who then was voted out of office a couple of weeks later, so they're back in joining. But what I found heartening is that hundreds of African civil society groups said, no, we like the International Criminal Court. Many, many African governments said, we're proud of this. This is Africa's contribution to the global rule of law. So you see this, this real debate, this real battle going on. And it shows that, even if unaccountable leaders don't like human rights because they get in the way of how they want to govern, people like human rights because human rights speak to their aspirations, they speak to their freedom.
Do you see the obstacle as being the lack of a free press, the lack of structural rigor in constitutions like you're alluding to in Africa that would preclude the Constitution from being ripped up and how just for our viewers who want to become more familiar with Human Rights Watch and how you try to enforce that accountability on rights, how do you distinguish between countries where it's just all out abuse and incremental regression?
No, that's a good question. Let me take a step backwards first and explain how Human Rights Watch works, because it's not obvious to people. How can we affect human rights on the other side of the world with some awful dictator? The methodology we use is we conduct very detailed investigations on the ground. Our staff is, the bulk of them are what we call researchers, who could be lawyers or journalists or academics, but people who live in the country or often of that country who conduct very detailed investigations. We publish their findings, and we use these reports to shame the abuse of government and to generate political pressure on them.
They're essentially embeds, if you want to think of it that way, in these countries.
They're embedded.
Chronicling the experience with respect to governments, journalists, and human rights.
And we have some 80 nationalities on staff. They're spread all over the world. And so these are people who are really immersed in their country, know it backwards and forwards, and are among the world's experts on human rights conditions in those countries. So they're well positioned to know what the problems are and to help to generate solutions. Now, obviously, there are different kinds of problems. A place like Syria, you've got mass atrocities. And so there the aim is to figure out, what's our source of leverage. It's not going to be to shame Assad, the Syrian president, but we can shame Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, whose military support for Assad is essential for Assad's survival. So how do we stop Assad from targeting civilians, targeting hospitals, targeting schools? Through Russia. So that's been our strategy there. You get other places, say like North Korea, which is, just an awful, brutal dictatorship. There's no war, there's just sheer repression. There we have to use different techniques. We've been focusing mainly on the UN Security Council and its effort to generate pressure there. But then other countries where, it's not a basket case, but you have limited civil society, governments that are trying to stifle the press, trying to undermine NGOs, trying to, just make it harder for people to band together and make their voices heard. That's a different technique. And their more traditional shaming works just fine because most governments pretend to respect human rights. Many governments fall short, but by highlighting that discrepancy, you do shame governments. You delegitimize them before their people, before the public, and that's how we gradually push them to improve.
I ask you that because Annika's experience was creating an index and identifying aspects of government that she would classify as democratic or tendencies towards anti-democratic behavior. But increasingly, as we've seen this post-truth democracy era take shape in some form, there's a question of what is democracy and what are those basic human rights, and to what extent are any lines drawn in the sand with respect to free expression. In the wake of President-elect Trump's victory, there are questions about looking inward at the American experience right now. How do you think And what is Human Rights Watch's role going to be in ensuring that those norms are modeled here just as much as they are internationally?
Well, that's a good question. And I should stress that the United States is one of the major countries that we work on. So while we work in 90 countries around the world, the United States is absolutely one of them. And the approach that Human Rights Watch takes is, there are excellent organizations like the ACLU that primarily use litigation. And if you can go to court to protect your rights, we essentially let the ACLU do that. Human Rights Watch is not a group of litigators. We instead use this methodology of public pressure. And so we tend to focus on issues where the courts are not the answer, but you need public policy, governmental action. So we tend to focus on mass incarceration and criminal justice, where nobody denies that these are actual crimes and people are convicted. But the question is it right to be throwing so many people in prison, particularly when so many of them are African Americans and other minorities? We do a lot of work on immigration reform, where there's no question that the U.S. is entitled to police its borders, but there are equitable questions come up. Is it fair to have millions of undocumented Mexicans who have made their lives here, who have their families here? They probably have U.S. citizen members of the family. They're members of the community. They work. Is it right to give them no route to legality, to have them living in constant insecurity? So that's an area where our approach can be very effective. Plus, we have a whole program on what we call national security, but the kinds of things that we fear Trump is going to implicate again the way the Bush administration did. We're going to try to avoid a return to torture. We're going to try to avoid reviving Guantanamo as a place where people are put. We're going to try to prevent the emergence of secret detention facilities. We want to make sure that drones are used lawfully. We want to make sure that there are right to privacy limits on mass surveillance. So these are major issues where we're quite concerned about the direction of a potential Trump administration.
And Ken, you are trying to channel the Athenian precedent. You were the recipient of the annual Athens Democracy Award. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Honor, which you received last year, September 2016. You said in your acceptance speech, certain demagogues today are appealing to majority fears of economic, cultural, and physical insecurity. I think that there is a reality that we don't want to accept right now with respect to the trajectory. There's been a lot of discussion about safeguarding and a safety net for a pluralistic society today, but there is a strong, pervasive wind that is opposed to the very definition of what we might think is an Athenian virtue. Mm-hmm. What do you think, from your experience as a federal prosecutor and now leading this organization, is the counsel that we ought to share with our friends, family, peers, fellow practitioners that will leave them with inspiration as opposed to dejection at what appears to be a crucial moment in our history, as I said at the beginning?
Yeah. I think the important lesson to send, Alexander, is that human rights are not an a la carte menu. You can't say, well, I like my rights, but yours, we don't need those. Because when you start picking and choosing among rights, you undermine the edifice that ultimately you're going to need. And we all know about, governments that started off going after the unpopular minorities. Gays often play that role in various societies, or the Roma in Europe, the gypsies. There's always somebody unpopular that nobody really cares about, and they don't focus on them when their rights are violated. But little by little, you see governments then violating others' rights. And I think we have to recognize that, the reason we have human rights is because there's a basic premise that we want to be treated, we have to treat others the way we want them to treat us. And if we start deviating from that principle, if we say, well, we'll mistreat you, but we still expect you to treat us well, you undermine the basic principles that stand at the heart of human rights.
And would you say that definition of reciprocity is really what is most fundamental to a definition? When we could get stuck in the weeds to defining is healthcare a human right? Is clean air a human right?
Right.
Your definition is one we might more conveniently coalesce around.
I mean, there's a legal answer to your question. Human rights are enshrined in various treaties that most governments have ratified. There's a U.S. constitutional
Right, and I'm
answer.
talking about the persuasion argument.
But at the basic level,
more than the legal one.
You got to ask, what kind of society do you want? And most people say, well, I want a society at least where my rights are respected. But you can't get that if you don't also respect others' rights, because.
But what is the link there in terms of the realization that reciprocity matters?
Well, in the sense that the rights are about approaching governance in a principled way. If you approach governments by just saying, I want what I want and I'm going to push it to the limit, tomorrow somebody else is going to want something different and you're going to be on the wrong end of that stick. So the only way to ensure that, your rights are not really trampled over the long term is to operate with some self-restraint. And that self-restraint is a principled one. It's saying, I'm not going to do something to you that I ultimately don't want you doing to me.
And finally, Ken, how much confidence do you have, alongside your partners at the ACLU and elsewhere, that states and cities and townships, these localities, are going to be effective in standing up against whatever may be federal abuses in the coming 4 years?
Well, I think one interesting aspect of the U.S. federal system is that it does give very substantial autonomy to states and indirectly to cities and municipalities. And so if indeed, say, the federal government radically cuts back on health care and Obamacare, that doesn't mean that states have to do that. You could have, follow the Massachusetts example, which had Obamacare before there was an Obama, or you could have states, enacting higher minimum wages, better respects for minority rights. There are lots of things that the states can do, even if the federal government falls back. And I think we may have to start looking to that and, in a sense, creating state-by-state models that over the long term we hope the federal government will then re-engage with.
Ken, thank you for being on the program today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Rosalind P. Walter Foundation. With special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and to the corporate community, Mutual of America.